In this session, we're going to begin the task of defining religion. And it's quite a task, because actually you could probably take a whole class that's just about defining religion. And certainly if you start looking at various religious studies textbooks, you will find a multitude of ways of defining religion. A multitude of approaches to religion, as well as a multitude of definitions within each of those approaches. So this is a huge task, but we're going to try to pull it down into something manageable for the purposes of this course. Let me say that by now, if you haven't, there's the readings written by the 4 different philosophers that you should have been working your way through. And we're going to talk about those a little bit in the next few sessions. But if you want to start reading through those readings, and then there's study questions for each of the readings that I would encourage you to look for as you do the readings. That's kind of the information I really want you to pull out of those essayists. But then we'll also talk about some of those responses too in these next few lectures. Before we start talking about defining religion, let's just talk about the word religion. I like words. I like to find out where words came from, what they originally meant, how they were originally used. I like that. And religion, as most words, has roots and root meanings to it that kind of help to begin thinking about what religion is and what it's about as a human phenomenon. And so when you take the word religion and you break the word down, the root of the word religion is lig, L-I-G. Now, if you think about that root, probably one of the places that come to mind if you think about other English words that would have that root, I always say if you're an athlete, you're familiar with this word, the word ligament. Ligament has the same root, lig, as the word religion, lig. Now what's a ligament do? It attaches things, it connects things. And that's what lig means. Something that connects, or something that attaches, or something that brings together. And so the root of the word religion is to connect, to attach, to bring together. Then, as probably most of us learned back in about 4th grade, is that if you put re in front of a word, you're saying again, or to restore something, to bring something back to how it was. And so just the word religion, its literal meaning is to connect again, or to bring back together, or to reattach. Now at this point, again, I always ask my students in my regular classes, so think about that. Think about what we call religion. Practices, communities, whatever. Just think about all the things involved in what we call religion from your scope of understanding. How does that make sense? I mean, why did somebody a long time ago look at this human behavior, this human phenomenon that now we call religion, and call it that? What did they see going on that caused them to go, oh, there's connecting again happening. Oh, there's reattaching that's happening. Oh, there's bringing back together again that's happening. What are some ways that you see that? Well, generally, students start talking about that, and within kind of what we might, in a word picture, see as kind of a horizontal perspective. The idea of the human and the divine, that there is reconnecting happening. There's coming back together again happening. In any religion, it doesn't matter what religion you're talking about, in any religion, there's kind of this larger, maybe kind of cosmic story where everything was together or complete or whole at one point in time. And then something happened that destroyed that completeness, that togetherness, that wholeness, that relationship. And so the journey of the religion is the restoration of what once was held between the divine and humans, this wholeness. And you can see that in every religion. I mean, think about the religions you're familiar with. There's probably some larger sort of redemption story, sort of restoring story about bringing things back together. mean, just the very word salvation that you find particularly within Judaism and Christianity. Actually, you find it within every religion. But salvation is the same, another word study, is basically the same root as the word salvage. So it's the idea of salvaging what you had and restoring it to its original condition. And every religion has that kind of story of something that was complete, something that was lost and is salvaged back to its original condition in some way. Then we also kind of talk about that on a more, did I say horizontal a while ago? I meant vertical level, excuse me. Earlier I was talking about the human and the divine. That's on a more vertical type perspective. On a more horizontal type perspective, just between humans. That in every major religion there are moral codes, there are ethical codes. And the purpose of that moral behavior, of that ethical behavior, is to restore relationship between people, is to heal relationships between people, is to ensure relationships between people, to keep connection, or to restore connection, or to nurture connection. That's why we have these ethical codes about how we should treat one another, that there's this connection that needs to be preserved. And there's even kind of this more reflective sense of ways that we even connect with ourselves again. Within any religious tradition, you will find the idea that participation in that religious tradition helps you to come to know not only God and not only others better, but yourself better. It helps you not only to understand reality better, but the reality of who you are better. That you reconnect with the reality of yourself even within religious tradition. So in a broad sense, just the literal meaning of the word religion gives us a lot to work with as far as what's involved in religion. That there's this reattaching, this reconnecting, this bringing back together again, this restoring that's happening, or salvaging that's happening within every religious tradition. But what about some definitions of religion? Well, when you start looking at different ways that people, that textbooks, that philosophers define religion, there's kind of two broad categories of definition. Some definitions are what we might call evaluative definitions, and some are what we could call descriptive definitions. And evaluative definitions are interested in, as it says, evaluating the truth of a religion, the validity of a religion, the rationality of religion or a religion. And so within this category of evaluative definitions, you find religious approaches. Maybe some of you went to a parochial school, or maybe some of you have taken a college class at a religiously denominational college on religion. And in those settings, the approach to defining religion tends to be this evaluative religious approach. I mean, probably understandable in that setting, where the approaches to religion are ones where they're trying to evaluate the truth, the validity of a religious belief. When I talk to students who went to parochial schools, of course they say, well, yeah, I had religion classes, but in my religion classes, what they focused on was why our religion was the true religion and why it was better than all these other religious belief systems. And so kind of the critiques of other belief systems. Well, that's an evaluative religious approach to defining religion. Defining a religion or defining religion as a whole. Another type of evaluative approach, one that's seeking to judge the truth of a religion, would be a philosophical approach. And a philosophical approach is just interested in saying, does it make sense? Is it rational? Is religion rational? Does it make sense to hold a religious worldview? Is a particular religion rational? Does it make sense from a philosophical point of view, not from a theological point of view, but from a philosophical point of view, does it make sense to hold this worldview, this religious worldview? And so both of these approaches, again, they are evaluating. Does a religious worldview make sense? Does religion make sense? From either a religious theological perspective or from a more secular but philosophical perspective. So there's evaluative approaches. But then there's also descriptive approaches. And again, these aren't so interested in trying to prove the truth of a religion, but a descriptive approach is just trying to understand what religion is. It's trying to define what religion is. But in defining religion from this more objective approach, there's still different angles that people come at it from. One might be a phenomenological approach. From a descriptive phenomenological approach, what people are asking is, for someone who is within a religious tradition, what does it mean to them? How do they describe their experience with it? You know, to some extent, we'll do that when we start talking about the major world religions in the second section of this course. You'll watch some videos where you'll hear from practitioners within particular belief systems. That's looking at the phenomenon of religion in that person's life. Sometimes in my live classes, I'll have a guest come in, a Jewish rabbi or an Islamic imam, come in and talk to the students in my class about that religion. That's about their experience within that religion. That's a phenomenological approach, an insider's perspective in describing what that religion is like, or what religion is like. Another descriptive approach is an historical approach. Just tracing the historical development of a religion or religious worldview. We'll do some of that in the second unit of the class. We'll talk about where we think this religious worldview began. We'll talk about how we think it began. We'll talk about how it moved through history and ways that it was affected by the world around it and ways it affected the world around it. That's an historical approach, just looking at the historical facts of a religion and religious history. A third kind of descriptive approach is what we could call a functional approach. And what a functional approach does is it basically looks at what's the function of religion. What's the function of religion in a person's life? What's the function of religion in a society or in the world? And it answers based on that. For people who say, religion gives me peace of mind, they're describing their religion functionally. That's how it functions in their lives. Religion gives me a reason to live. That's a functional definition of religion. Religion causes a lot of wars. That's a functional definition. Religion unites people. It's talking about functions of religion. And so functional definition looks at the activity of religion and defines religion based on that activity, uniting, dividing, giving purpose, so on and so forth. Another type of descriptive approach to defining religion would be comparative approaches. And to some extent, what comparative approaches do is they start with what's the common ground among religious worldviews. And then from that common ground, reach out into what's distinct then about different worldviews. When we finish the section on world religions, I'll give you a chart. And on that chart, we'll list the 5 major world religions: Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And then across the top of that chart, I'll list things like the founder, when it began, the sacred text, the basic beliefs, the basic practice, the goal of each of those. Those are the comparative aspects of all those religions. They all have some sort of story about where they began. They all have some sort of approach to sacred literature. They all have some sort of spiritual goal. And so we'll start with those places and then talk about what's distinct then, because the goals are different. The sacred literature is different. The approaches to how you practice the religions are different. But you begin from this comparative spot of what's common, and then out of that commonness, what's distinct among each of the worldviews. So in this class, we're primarily going to be looking at this descriptive angle of religion. We're going to look at the insider's perspective. We're going to look at the history of religions, how it functions, and some of the shared aspects of religions and the distinctiveness that you find within those shared aspects. We're also going to look at some philosophical approaches to religion as well. Actually, to some extent, maybe kind of the working definition we're going to end up with is a more philosophical definition of religion. Just ways to evaluate if it even kind of makes sense as a worldview for people to hold, regardless of where they live in the world and what their beliefs are. But what I've asked you to do up to this point, or if you haven't done yet, you need to do, is read these 4 philosophers and read their approaches to defining religion. 2 of these are more functional approaches to defining religion. One is a more philosophical approach to defining religion. And another one is a more phenomenological approach to defining religion. What's the experience of it? So I want to start talking through those. Probably in this lecture, we'll get through the first 2, and then we'll start the next lecture with the other 2. But first of all, I ask you to read a section from a book written by Rudolph Otto. Otto wrote a lot of books about religion and about this religious phenomenon. But the one that I've asked you to read an excerpt from is probably his most famous book. It's called The Idea of the Holy. And basically what Otto was doing in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century was he was trying to figure out what's the common thread that you find among everything that we call religion. And he was going to let that common thread be his definition of religion. And so he was looking at the phenomenon, the phenomenology of religion, how it plays out in people's lives. And so he, either by observation or by study of others' observations, looked at what's the seed that's shared among everything we call religion. I mean, if you've got a man wearing nothing but a loincloth, dancing like a madman around a fire, and there are some who would say that's religion. And then you've got a man dressed in an elaborate robe that's trimmed in gold, and he's in a huge cathedral. It's got stained glass windows. It's very somber and quiet and kind of cold. And we say, that's religion. What do those 2 experiences share? What's the common thread that runs between those 2 experiences? What's the seed that you find here and here that causes us to call both of those and everything in between and around them religion? That was Otto's question. Again, probably a more phenomenological approach. And so as his pursuit of that answer is what he's written about in this book, The Idea of the Holy. So what I asked you to do was to look at 3 major things in this reading to try to understand that. And so first of all, I ask you, how does Otto describe the holy? I mean, he talks about the idea of the holy. So how does he describe the holy, and to what does he seem to be referring? And so generally, as students list the things that they wrote in class in answer to that question, they may not quite know what they mean, but as they start putting things on the board, things like that the holy is that to which all religions point. The holy is not rational, but it's a different dimension. The holy is viewed as some sort of a source. The holy is viewed as something extraordinary. The holy is viewed as something that you cannot describe with words. And so he called it the holy because there weren't adequate words for it. The holy is something that is not about morality, but something beyond or separate from morality. It's not just about morality. And so we put all that list of stuff on the board, and then I say to students, okay, so what's he talking about when he's talking about the holy? And it doesn't take long for students to come to the conclusion that probably what a lot of them would call, what Otto calls the holy, God. That it's this supernatural reality that isn't contained by rationale. That the holy is not about moral goodness. And we tend to use that word to talk about moral goodness, and so he's trying to break that down in his definition. That when I say, oh, you think you're holier than I am, or you think you're so holy, we're talking about a moral statement. But Otto is saying, no, it's beyond that. The idea of holy is that this is something that is unique, that there's nothing else like it, that there's something separate. And so when he's talking about the holy, he's talking about this kind of the supernatural realm of existence. He's talking about what some of us might call the divine, or some of us might call God. Now I always ask the students, so why doesn't he call it God instead of calling it the holy? Well, of course, the quick, obvious answer to the discerning student is that not all religions, not all spiritual perspectives would call that dimension God. It might not even be anything personal. It might be a force or an energy. And so all that is contained in this idea of the holy, the supernatural dimension. Then I ask you to explore what Otto is talking about when he talks about mysterium tremendum, a phrase that he made up. And we usually end up with a lot of words on the board when I have students respond to that as far as what they dug out of the reading. They'll say it's something that is attractive. It's something that's repulsive. It's something that's peaceful. It's something that's beautiful. It's something that's barbaric. It's something that's primitive. It's something that's ecstatic. It's something that comes in like a surge of an ocean. There's this whole range of really emotions that Otto talks about when he's talking about this idea of mysterium tremendum. And so the basic idea that he's referring to with mysterium tremendum is that it's the emotional response that one has in the presence of the holy. Sometimes that's peaceful, sometimes it's fearful. Sometimes that felt really good and you'd like to experience that again, and sometimes you don't ever want to experience that again because it was so fearful. That there's all these different ways that different religions talk about the approach of the supernatural realm and what that feels like for the human. And so from those first two questions that you've responded to from Otto, you basically have his definition of religion. That religion is the human response, particularly an emotional response, to a supernatural reality. It's not just any emotional experience. You know, some students who try to way simplify it say, well, there's a lot of things that are emotional experiences that I wouldn't call religion. Well, Otto would say the same thing. Religion is when there's some sort of emotional experience that the person believes is their response to something supernatural. I mean, you could ride on a wild roller coaster ride and have an emotional experience, but Otto would not call that religion. Now, if you were riding on that roller coaster and one aspect of the emotional experience was that you thought an angel came and sat down beside you and put its arm around you to comfort you, that would make it a religious experience because it was an emotional response to something supernatural. And so whether it's the guy in the cathedral, or the guy dancing around the fire, or a friend of yours at some weekend spiritual retreat, what Otto says makes something religion is a human emotional response to something supernatural. And you can dress that up in a lot of ways. You can put a lot of rituals around that. You can put a lot of beliefs and morals and ethics around that. But the seed, the core, the thread that Otto says is shared among all things that we call religion is this emotional response that's unexplainable, mysterious, mysterium, this unexplainable emotional response to something that's supernatural. The third question I asked you to answer in response to Otto was this, that though Otto asserts that no one can cause themselves to have a numinous experience, so we can't make it happen ourselves, something supernatural is believed to be the source of it, he does say that there are things that may be conducive to having a numinous experience. What are some of those things? So these are not things that people can do that will automatically cause this spiritual experience. And the word he uses for these spiritual experiences is numinous experiences. But there are things we can do that might open up the possibility, might make it more likely that someone would have one of these experiences. Some of the specific things that Otto talks about is participating in certain rituals. when people worship, when they pray, when they chant, when they participate in communion, when they meditate, when they go to a Native American sweat lodge, that these rituals are things that open up the possibility of having a numinous experience, of having an unexplainable experience of a supernatural source. Now, does every time somebody pray, do they have a numinous experience? No. Every time somebody participates in the Eucharist, do they have a numinous experience? No. Every time somebody participates in a baptism, do they have a no. Every time they go to Native American sweat lodge? No. But do they sometimes? Yes. Is that what's often anticipated by participating in these? Yes. And certainly, I think Otto even argued that sometimes it's hard to tell what we generated ourselves and what was supernatural. But that what truly makes it a religious or numinous experience is when it came from a supernatural source and not just from our own doing. So participating in certain rituals, going to certain sites, to certain monuments, to certain memorials may open up this type of experience. If you walk into Notre Dame in Paris, some people might have a numinous experience. I have a friend, not a religious person really in any sense of the word, but when she was backpacking through Europe back several summers ago, when she came back, she told me about an experience that she had where she went to this cathedral to take pictures of the stained glass, and she said she walked into the cathedral, and she said, I just burst into tears. It was like something overwhelmed me. Well, as she described it, she was describing what Otto calls a numinous experience. And she was like, I don't know if it was God or what it was, but something caused this experience. Well, she was describing that by walking into this cathedral. I have stepped into some voodoo temples in Haiti where the hair kind of stood on the back of my neck a little bit. Now, that was maybe one of those more not so attracting types of experiences. It was an experience that was like, oh, I really like that. I'd like to go hang out at that temple for a while. But there was some sense that there was something there in that place. And again, I don't know how much of that was my own preconceptions or how much of that was really some sort of spiritual encounter. But there are those who would interpret that as a spiritual encounter on that more primitive, barbaric, fearful end probably. But that there's certain places that might generate the possibility of this type of experience. A third aspect that Otto talks about that might be conducive to having this kind of experience is the lives of certain people. Back, I think it was in 1999-2000, when the Pope was Pope John Paul was in St. Louis. A lot of students made the pilgrimage to St. Louis to see the Pope. And most of them came back like, yeah, it was a really cool experience, got to see the Pope. But there were some that described a numinous experience in the presence of the Pope. I think when Mother Teresa was alive, I think that for some of us, regardless of whether you're Catholic or Christian or not, if you were sitting in a little room with Mother Teresa and she started telling you about things that she had done that day on the streets of Calcutta, India, for some of us, you might start getting the sense that there's something bigger going on around that life, something unexplainably supernatural. That the life of this person and other people sometimes cause us to have that sense of something bigger, of a supernatural reality. So Otto's definition, again, is probably a more phenomenological definition. From the experience of those who are within religion, what is religion? Well, it's the unexplainable emotional response to a supernatural reality. That's what he found is this thread that connects all things in religion. The second author that I ask you to read, who kind of goes to the total other end of the spectrum, and he would be a more functional approach to religion, is Karl Marx. And in the Marx essay, I ask you to simply just go through and make a list of all the things that Marx says about religion in these excerpts that I have you to read. What is religion? Where does it come from? How does it function? What's the problem with it? Several things like that. So let me kind of go over some of the things that are probably most notable. Those of you who read closely, you've probably got a list of 15 or 20 things. But let me pull out some of the ones that are pretty seminal to what Marx tends to say about religion. These first 3 or 4 are probably the most famous statements that Marx makes about religion. Now let me say, first of all, as you know, Marx is not a theologian. Marx was not a religious philosopher. Marx was a social scientist. He was an economist. But in his development of economic theory, of social scientific theory, one aspect that he found that he believed had a significant effect on the economy and on social structure was religion. And so Marx actually wrote a great deal about religion. Marx was a man who was raised in a Jewish family, at least in his early years. His father was Jewish. He was a lawyer, but several generations of grandfathers before that were rabbis. He was raised in Europe during the 19th century. And one thing that happened in Marx's life was that there in Europe as a lawyer, because his father was Jewish, he couldn't get a job. And so his father claimed conversion to Christianity. And simply by calling himself another religion, he got a job. Well, Marx saw that early on in his life and started seeing religion as more of a tool in an economic system than anything else. And that was kind of the seed that projected him into developing all these theories about religion within an economic, social, scientific structure. So a few of the things that Marx said about religion that are more famous things that you read about was, first of all, that it's the opium of the people, or it's the opiate of the masses, is sometimes what you find in other places. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, obviously, opium was a drug, and actually a very famous drug, very known drug at that time. And so the idea is that it's like a drug, that people take it to feel better, and maybe they do for a time, but are they really better? No. The problem's still there. Nothing's changed. The drug gives them a false happiness, and that's one of the things that you see several times as you read through here, that it's an illusory happiness, that it's a false happiness, that it's a false hope. They get this high from religion that causes them to look at their situation and decide, yeah, life's hard here, but if I endure, if I follow the laws of my religion, then when this life is over, I'm going to have a better life. And Marx is like, how do you know that? Why not try to make a difference in this life rather than bank on something that you don't even know is there? As a matter of fact, Marx would have asserted it wasn't there. And so it gives a false happiness where people, because of their religion, they stay in oppressive situations, hanging on to a hope that Marx asserted they were never going to see, they were never going to have. Related to that, Marx said, another one of his most famous statements about religion is that man made religion, religion did not make man. And the corollary to that in other places is that man made God, God did not make man, according to Marx. That song that you listened to from YouTube back in the lecture on suffering, one of the questions is, did you make mankind after we made you? That's a Marxist statement. That we created the idea of God, but then we treat this idea like we didn't create it, like it created us, and like it's created our reality. And Marx is like, it's this inverted consciousness that we live in. It's an error in understanding of reality to think that God controls things when we created the idea of God ourselves to try to help us feel better about things. Marx said, the abolition of religion as people's illusory happiness is the demand for their real happiness. That if people would let go of these false promises of religion that say, don't seek revenge on those who oppress you, bear up under suffering, if you're poor in this life, you'll be rich in the next life. But Marx is saying, if you take off those shackles and decide, I'm going to try to be a part of a revolution in this life, to try to find a way to overcome the oppression that's on me and others in this life, that's the truest happiness. Simply bearing up under suffering and oppression in this life, hoping for a happiness in the next life that may not even come, Marx says that's not real happiness, that's illusory happiness. The real happiness is to work to make a difference in this world. He said that religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the spirit of spiritless conditions. And then he goes on to conclude that, which that kind of sounds beautiful about religion to some extent, that it's the relief for people. It gives heart to heartless situations. It gives spirit to spiritless situations. And then he says, and it's a drug. It's not real. You think it's doing that stuff for you, but it's not. You got to keep taking the pill, and you'll keep feeling this stuff. But when you quit taking the pill and you wake up, you realize, I'm still oppressed. This is still a heartless condition. This is still a spiritless condition. My religion didn't change this painful reality. He said the only emancipation or freedom of Germany possible in practice is emancipation based on the theory proclaiming that man is the highest essence of man. He's saying as long as we believe that God is the highest being, then we're going to stay trapped in this kind of oppression that we deal with. And no change will come in the economic or social system of this culture or of this world. But if we can get rid of that and realize we are our best hope, maybe we can make a difference. Maybe we could throw off these oppressive chains. So basically what Marx said in what you've read about religion, and there's a lot that he said, is that religion gives oppressed people false hope. Religion gives suffering people false hope. And so it makes these promises that things can be better, that things will be better, but there's no guarantee of that. As a matter of fact, Marx, who was truly a materialist, who said the only thing we can count on is what's material, what we can see and touch and feel. To put your faith in things that you can't see and touch and feel, that's a big risk. But he said that to free ourselves from these promises of happiness that are probably false allows us to really change our situation and our condition in this world. So religion functions, and again, this is a critique, obviously, from Marx. Religion functions to give oppressed people a false hope. Functional definition of religion. We're going to look at two more, another functional definition and one that's probably a more philosophical definition of religion as we begin our next session.